Welcome back to the Olive Grove podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Isaiah chapter 10.
Okay.
And we are going to be looking at a study from my Christian space called MCS Isaiah chapter 10.
Excellent.
And this chapter tackles some weighty themes like judgment, leadership, and God's power. And I think those are all things that our listeners are interested in.
Absolutely. And what I find so fascinating about this chapter is that it's not just recounting historical events or anything like that. It's really offering a timeless reflection on human nature,
Yeah.
It's almost as if Isaiah is holding up this mirror to us, to all of us, and our own struggles with leadership and what happens when we stray from God's path.
And it is striking how relevant this chapter still feels today.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Isaiah 10, it kicks off with this pretty scathing critique of corrupt leaders.
Right.
Those who are twisting justice.
Yeah.
And just exploiting the vulnerable.
Yes, exploiting the vulnerable.
In verses 2 through 4,
Yes.
Isaiah doesn't pull any punches, does he?
No, not at all. He paints this very vivid picture of leaders who are preying on the poor,
Right.
robbing widows, taking advantage of orphans.
Wow.
It's a stark reminder that true leadership is not about self-serving ambition,
Right.
but about protecting and caring for those who need it most.
And it's almost heartbreaking
Yeah,
how those verses resonate even now,
it really is.
centuries later.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of people in power turning their backs on the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's a reality we see all too often, unfortunately.
All the time, unfortunately. And that's precisely why I think this chapter is so crucial.
Yeah.
It serves as this timeless indictment against such injustices.
Right.
And reminds us that true leadership is about accountability, serving others, and advocating for those who are marginalized.
Okay, so we've got these corrupt leaders, but then the chapter takes a turn.
It does.
And in verses 5 through 7,
Yes.
we're introduced to the Assyrians.
That's right.
Now they're described as God's instrument of judgment, a tool he's using to discipline Israel.
It's an interesting concept, isn't it?
It is.
To kind of grapple with.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, you have this brutal empire known for its ruthlessness, right? And on the other hand, the text presents them as being used by God to carry out his purposes.
Right.
So it really forces us to consider, those complexities of God's sovereignty and how he might work even through seemingly negative forces to achieve his ultimate plan.
You've hit on something I've always found fascinating about this chapter.
Okay.
The Assyrians are this formidable force, but ultimately they're still under God's control.
Yeah.
It's like a shepherd using a rod to guide his sheep, even if it means a little bit of tough love.
Right, exactly. It highlights the fact that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating events, even when we don't fully understand his methods.
And speaking of not understanding,
Okay.
verses 8 through 11 shows us the Assyrian king's arrogance.
Oh, yeah.
He's basically claiming all the credit for his conquests,
He is. Yeah.
boasting about his power as if it were self-made.
Yeah, and that's where we see that classic downfall of pride,
Yeah.
He's missing the point completely. He's a tool in God's hand.
Right.
And all his victories are ultimately orchestrated by a higher power.
It's like he's trying to take credit for the work of a master craftsman while completely ignoring the one who actually designed and shaped the creation.
Exactly. And that brings us to a very pivotal point in the chapter, verses 12 through 15.
Okay.
God steps in and basically says, hold on, I'm the one wielding the axe here. You're just the instrument.
I love that analogy of the axe and the saw. It's so simple yet profound.
It is.
No matter how skilled the woodcutter,
Right.
it's the power behind the tool that does the real work.
It's a powerful reminder for all of us, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
We can get so caught up in our own abilities and accomplishments. But this passage challenges us to remember the source of our strength
Yeah.
and our wisdom.
And wisdom.
It's a call to humility to recognize that apart from God, we can achieve nothing of lasting value.
So we've got these corrupt leaders, God using the Assyrians for his purpose, and this stark warning against pride.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, judgment is coming.
It's coming.
Verses 16 through 19
Yes.
paint a pretty intense picture of what's going to happen to the Assyrians.
They do.
There's this powerful imagery of fire,
Right.
a symbol of purification that God will use to cleanse the land.
And it's not just a gentle cleansing, is it?
No.
Isaiah describes thorns and briars being consumed, the glory of the forest being burned away.
Wow.
It's a picture of complete and utter destruction,
Wow.
a consequence of their arrogance and the oppression that they inflicted.
It's a sobering reminder that our actions have consequences
Absolutely.
and that even the most powerful empires
Yeah.
are ultimately accountable to God.
That's right. There's no escaping the justice of God, no matter how mighty we may think we are.
But even in the midst of this impending judgment,
Yeah.
there's a glimmer of hope.
There is.
In verses 20 through 23, we see that God is offering a path to restoration. He speaks of a remnant of Israel who will repent and return to him.
Yes.
What's particularly interesting is how this word remnant
Yes.
is repeated.
Right.
It feels like more than just a casual mention,
Yeah.
almost like a key to understanding God's plan.
It definitely has a deeper significance, you know? The idea of a remnant suggests that even in the midst of widespread disobedience and judgment, God preserves a faithful few.
Right.
They become the foundation for future restoration.
Yes.
And a testament to his unwavering love and mercy.
You know, when I think about that remnant, it makes me think of those powerful testimonies you hear.
Oh, yeah.
Stories of people going through incredibly tough times, but coming out stronger on the other side. It's like seeing that concept of a remnant being refined through trials play out in real life.
What a beautiful connection, you
Yeah.
know? It's those stories that remind us that even when things seem bleak, God is at work.
Right.
And his plan for redemption is always unfolding.
And speaking of reminders,
Yeah.
in verses 24 through 27, God reminds Israel of his past deliverances, like freeing them from
Yeah.
Egypt and Midian.
Yes.
It's as if he's saying, hey, remember what I've done for you before.
Yeah.
Don't lose hope now.
It's such a powerful encouragement.
Yeah.
It's about drawing on that shared history, that covenant relationship,
Right.
to bolster their faith and remind them that God is faithful to his promises.
And I think there's a lesson for us in there, too,
Absolutely.
about the importance of sharing our own stories of God's faithfulness. You know those moments when he's shown up in our lives?
Yes.
Those testimonies can be a source of strength and hope for others who might be facing their own challenges.
Absolutely. Sharing our stories can be a powerful way to build each other up and remind one another that God is working,
Right.
even when we can't see the full picture.
So we've got this incredible backdrop of judgment, hope and reminders of God's faithfulness. Then in verses 28 through 32, there's this dramatic shift in the narrative.
Oh, yeah.
The scene is set for the Assyrian army's advance toward Jerusalem. And you can practically feel the fear and anxiety as they approach.
The way Isaiah describes their march, you know, listing the towns and villages they pass through, it's almost like a soundtrack of dread and anticipation building up to this inevitable confrontation.
But even with that sense of impending doom,
Yes.
there's this underlying thread of reassurance, a reminder that God is still in control, that he hasn't abandoned his people.
It speaks to that unwavering trust that we're called to have.
Right.
Even when circumstances seem dire,
Yeah.
we have to remember that God's ways are higher than our ways.
Right.
And he's always working for the good of those who love him,
Right.
even when we can't see it. He's orchestrating events, moving pieces on the chessboard
Yeah.
to ultimately bring about his purposes.
And then we reach the climax of this section of Isaiah chapter 10,
We do.
verses 33 and 34.
Yes.
It's the downfall of the mighty Assyrians.
Yeah.
And Isaiah uses this incredibly powerful imagery of Lebanon's cedars being cut down. You know, those towering trees, symbols of strength and majesty.
Yeah.
They're brought low.
That imagery is so striking. It's a vivid portrayal of how even the most powerful entities, those who seem invincible, can be humbled and brought low by God.
It's a reminder that no matter how strong or mighty we may seem in this world, we're all ultimately accountable to God and subject to his power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, but also a comforting one, right?
Yeah.
Because it reminds us that God is the ultimate judge and justice will ultimately prevail.
And it makes you think twice about where you're placing your trust and confidence, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Are we relying on our own strength
Yeah.
and our own wisdom? Or are we acknowledging that true power and lasting victory come from God?
That's such a crucial question for us to consider, you know?
Yeah.
Because when we place our trust in ourselves and our own limited understanding and abilities, that's when we really set ourselves up for a fall.
Yeah, it's like building your house on sand instead of solid rock.
Exactly.
So as we reflect on this section of Isaiah chapter 10, it feels like we're seeing a clear pattern emerge.
What do you mean?
Well, we have these corrupt leaders who are abusing their power. And God uses a foreign nation, the Assyrians,
Right.
as his instrument of judgment.
Yes.
But even the Assyrians, in their arrogance and pride,
Yeah.
they fail to recognize that their power is ultimately derives from God.
Right.
They become a cautionary tale,
Mm-hmm.
a warning against self-reliance and the fleeting nature of worldly power.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just about individual leaders either. This pattern can play out on a national level as well.
Right.
When nations forget God, when they turn away from his principles of justice and righteousness, they inevitably face consequences.
It's a reminder that God's standards apply to everyone, regardless of their status or position.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, what about that remnant that Isaiah talked about? How do they fit into this whole picture?
That's a great question. The remnant represents those who remain faithful to God, even when surrounded by corruption and apostasy.
Right.
They're the ones who recognize their need for his grace and mercy, who choose to humble themselves and seek his guidance.
So in a way, they embody the opposite of what we see in the Assyrian king.
Absolutely.
While he's boasting about his self-made power, the remnant is acknowledging their dependence on God.
Precisely. And it's through this remnant that God's plan for restoration and redemption is carried out.
Right.
They become the seeds of hope, the foundation upon which a new and righteous society can be built.
You know, it's almost like a spiritual reset button. God allows judgment to come, to cleanse and purify. And then he uses this faithful remnant to start fresh,
Right.
to build something new and beautiful out of the ashes of the old.
And it's a reminder that God is always working, even in the midst of what might seem like destruction and chaos. He's always preserving a faithful few, a remnant, who will carry his torch forward.
It makes you think about the power of individual faith and the impact that even a small group of committed believers can have.
Absolutely. Think about the early church, a small group of disciples who, despite persecution and opposition, spread the message of the gospel and changed the course of history.
Wow.
It's a testament to the power of a remnant, a faithful few who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, even when it's unpopular or difficult.
And speaking of standing up for what you believe in, that reminder from God in verses 24 through 27, where he reminds Israel of his past deliverances, so powerful.
It is. You know, it's like he's saying, remember who I am.
Right.
Remember what I've done for you. Don't lose heart now.
Right.
It's a call to remember God's faithfulness, his power to deliver and to draw strength from those past victories.
It's almost like a spiritual pep talk, a reminder that we serve a God who has a track record of showing up in incredible ways.
And it highlights the importance of not just remembering those moments ourselves, but also sharing them with others, because those stories of God's faithfulness, those testimonies can be a lifeline for someone who's struggling, who's doubting, who's wondering if God is even there.
It's about being a beacon of hope, sharing our own experiences of God's grace and power to encourage and uplift others.
You know, it's interesting how these themes of judgment, hope, and remembrance all weave together in this chapter.
Yeah.
It's like they're building on each other, creating this tapestry of God's character and his plan for humanity.
And as we've journeyed through these verses, we've encountered so many thought-provoking insights, so many reminders of God's sovereignty, his justice, his mercy.
It's been a rich and challenging exploration, hasn't it?
It has.
It's made me think about my own life, my own leadership, my own areas of pride and self-reliance. It's a call to humility, to surrender, to recognize that apart from God, I can do nothing.
And for me, it's reinforced the importance of sharing my faith, my story, my experiences of God's faithfulness, because you never know who might be listening, who might be needing to hear that message of hope and encouragement.
Yeah, it's like we're all part of this this grand narrative, the story that God is writing. And our individual testimonies, our experiences of his grace and faithfulness, they become like threads, you know,
Right.
that weave together to create this beautiful tapestry of redemption.
What a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that even though we may feel small or insignificant, our lives, our stories, they matter. They have the power to impact others, to point them towards the hope and healing that can only be found in Christ.
Exactly. It's about using our voices, our experiences to share the good news of the gospel, to encourage one another, and to build up the body of Christ.
So we've journeyed through judgment. We've explored the consequences of pride. We've been reminded of God's faithfulness and the power of a remnant now. as we wrap up our deep dive into Isaiah chapter 10. I'm curious what stands out to you the most from this chapter.
For me, it's the constant tension between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. We see God orchestrating events, using nations like Assyria for his purposes, but we also see individuals making choices facing the consequences of their actions. It reminds us that even though God is in control, he still allows us to exercise our free will, and we are accountable for the choices we make.
That's a great point, and it highlights the complexity of faith, doesn't it? It's not about simple answers or easy solutions. It's about wrestling with these big questions, grappling with the mysteries of God's ways, and ultimately trusting that he is working all things together for good.
And it's about recognizing that even in the midst of judgment, God is always offering a path to redemption. He's always extending his mercy and grace to those who humble themselves and turn to him.
And that brings us back to that concept of the remnant, doesn't it? Those who choose to stand apart to remain faithful, even when surrounded by corruption and apostasy, they become the seeds of hope, the agents of change, the ones who carry the torch of faith forward.
And it's a reminder that God can use anyone, regardless of their background, their past, their current circumstances. He can take broken vessels, flawed individuals, and transform them into instruments of his grace and power.
It's a message that resonates deeply with me, especially when I think about my own journey, the times I've stumbled, the times I've felt far from God. It's a reminder that his love is relentless, his grace is sufficient, and his power is made perfect in our weakness.
And it's a challenge, isn't it? To choose humility over pride, to surrender our will to his, to be willing to be used by him, even if it means stepping outside of our comfort zones, challenging the status quo, or standing up for what's right even when it's difficult.
Absolutely. It's a call to action, an invitation to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to be agents of change, to be bearers of hope in a world that desperately needs it.
And as we go from this deep dive into Isaiah chapter 10, let's not forget the power of sharing our stories, those testimonies of God's faithfulness, those glimpses of his grace at work in our lives. They can be such a source of encouragement and strength for others.
I couldn't agree more so. Let's continue to explore, to learn to grow, and to share our faith with boldness and compassion.
And remember, even when we don't see the full picture, God is working, orchestrating events, weaving together the threads of our lives to create a masterpiece of redemption.
And before we wrap up this episode of the Olive Grove podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube and visit the My Christian Space website for early drops of the podcast. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Isaiah chapter 10, and until next time, may you walk in the peace and power of the Almighty.